For 3 years, the most powerful woman in Alberta couldn't lift her right hand above her shoulder, and nobody in her boardroom ever mentioned it. That was the first thing Nathan Kowalski noticed when he walked into the Vance Capitol building on a Tuesday morning in late February, his tool bag over one shoulder and his daughter's crayon drawing still folded in his shirt pocket. He had been called in to fix the climate control wiring on the executive floor, a job that was supposed to take 2 hours. He ended up staying for 6 weeks, though not because of the wiring. Sylvia Vance was 51 years old, though she looked younger from a distance and older up close, the way people do when they've been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She ran Vance Capital with the kind of precision that made her competitors nervous and her board quietly grateful. Quarterly returns that outpaced every comparable firm in Western Canada, a reputation for reading markets the way other people read weather, and a personal discipline that bordered on the monastic. She arrived at the office at 6:45 every morning. She left at 8. She took no vacations. She had not missed a single board meeting in 11 years. What the annual reports did not mention was that for the past 34 months, Sylvia Vance had been managing a progressive nerve condition that had begun as occasional numbness in her right arm and had gradually, methodically, dismantled her ability to move it with any reliability. Some mornings, she could grip a pen normally. Other mornings, she woke to find her entire right side burning from the inside, like a wire shorting under its insulation. Her neurologist, Dr. Prescott Halvard, had been treating her since the symptoms first appeared. He had run tests. He had consulted specialists. He had put her on a course of medication that he described, in the careful language of someone who knows more than he is saying, as the current gold standard for presentations of this type. He had adjusted the protocol twice. He had reassured her, each time she sat across from him in his Glenora clinic, that the condition was being managed. What he had not done was make it better. Sylvia had accepted this. She was not by nature a person who raged against what could not be changed. She adapted. She learned to sign documents with her left hand. She restructured her schedule to front-load the hours when her symptoms were mildest. She hired a second executive assistant, framing it as a workload issue. She told no one at the firm what was happening. She told no one anywhere except her son, and only because he had noticed on Christmas Day that she was cutting her turkey with the wrong hand and had asked her, quietly, in the kitchen, what was going on. She told him it was temporary. She had been saying that for 2.5 years. Nathan was 38 and had been doing electrical work since he was 22, first as an apprentice under his uncle in Red Deer, then on his own when his uncle retired and left him the van and half the client list. He was not the kind of man who got called into buildings like Vance Capital very often. The contract had come through a facilities management company that subcontracted for the building's owner, and Nathan had taken it because February was slow and because his daughter, Lily, had decided she needed a specific brand of running shoes for her school track trials, and they cost more than he had budgeted. He was not intimidated by the office. He had worked in fancier buildings. He was focused mostly on getting the job done without disturbing anyone important, because buildings like this one had a way of making everything take twice as long when the people in expensive suits started asking questions. He was tracing a conduit run along the ceiling of the executive corridor when he first saw Sylvia Vance through the glass wall of the corner office. She was standing at her desk, reviewing something on a large monitor, and she was holding her right arm pressed tight against her side, her elbow at a rigid angle, while her left hand scrolled through the document. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people would not have noticed. Nathan noticed because his mother had stood exactly that way for 2 years after her accident. He knew what it meant to hold an arm like that, not resting, not comfortable, but braced, controlled, hidden. He did not say anything. He went back to his conduit. The second time he saw it was later that afternoon. He was testing the repaired circuit at the breaker panel near the executive kitchen when Sylvia came in to refill her water glass. She reached for the glass with her right hand out of habit, then stopped, a pause so brief that anyone not watching would have missed it, and switched to her left. She filled the glass, turned, and walked back down the corridor without looking at him. Nathan drove home that evening with Lily asleep in the back seat, her track bag across her knees, and he thought about that pause the whole way. He had no reason to think about it. That was the honest truth. She was a client in the most indirect sense of the word. He was there to fix the wiring, not to notice things that weren't his business. and yet the pause kept coming back to him, not because he was nosy, but because there had been something in it that reminded him of his mother trying to pretend she was fine at the dinner table, passing dishes she couldn't hold, laughing at jokes so no one would watch her face when she reached for her fork. On Wednesday morning, he was on the executive floor again, finishing the last of the circuit work. One of the assistants asked him if he could also look at a flickering light in the small meeting room adjacent to Sylvia's office, which was not technically in his scope but was a 20-minute job, and he said yes. The meeting room shared a thin wall with her office, not thin enough to hear words, but thin enough when he was standing on the step stool examining the fixture to hear tone. And the tone he heard on the other side of the wall was the tone of a conversation where one person is being managed. He could not make out what was being said. He could hear the cadence. He had heard it before, in a different context, the careful, measured reassurance that was actually a form of control. The way a certain kind of authority sounds when it is telling someone not to worry about something they have every right to worry about. He replaced the bulb and left. He told himself he was done with it. Then, on Thursday, he was back on the executive floor because the repair from Tuesday had developed a fault in one of the junction boxes, a common issue in old wiring, nothing unusual. And while he was in the electrical room, he overheard two of the junior analysts talking in the break room next door. They were not being indiscreet. They were talking about what everyone at a certain level in a company talks about, who is secure and who is not. The name they were discussing was Sylvia Vance. The name they kept circling back to was Halvard. Nathan was not a man who read financial news or followed corporate governance, but he understood, from the fragments drifting through the wall, that there was a board review coming, that there were questions being raised about leadership capacity, that someone, and the way they said Halvard's name suggested it was Halvard, had been providing the board with assessments of Sylvia Vance's long-term fitness to lead. He tightened the junction box and packed his bag and said nothing. But on his way to the elevator, he passed the administrative assistant at the front desk, and he stopped. And he asked her, because he had been turning it over in his mind all week, and he couldn't leave it alone, whether Ms. Vance's condition was being treated by someone local or whether she saw specialists elsewhere. The assistant stared at him. "I'm sorry," she said. "What condition?" Nathan said he must have been thinking of a different building, thanked her, and left. He almost didn't go back. The junction box was done. His invoice was submitted. There was no professional reason to return. He sat in his van in the parking structure for 10 minutes on Thursday afternoon and tried to talk himself out of what he was considering, which was going back inside and saying something to a woman he had never met about a medical situation he did not understand, based on nothing more than an overheard conversation and a feeling in his chest that felt uncomfortably like the one he'd had the night before his mother's third surgery, when he'd sat in a hospital hallway and realized no one was actually going to advocate for her except him. Lily's picture was still in his shirt pocket, a horse standing in a field. She had given it to him Monday morning and said it was for good luck on the new job. He got out of the van. He asked to speak with Ms. Vance. He was told she was in a meeting. He said he could wait. The assistant, a different one, this time, younger, looked uncertain and called through. 40 minutes later, Sylvia Vance appeared in the lobby with the expression of someone who has agreed to a brief interruption they expect to regret. "You're the electrician," she said. "Yes." "The work is done, isn't it?" "It is. This isn't about the work." She looked at him the way people look when they're trying to decide whether something is worth the energy. Then she said 3 minutes and led him into a small side room off the lobby. He told her, as directly as he could, what he had observed and what he had heard. He did not cushion it. He said he knew it was not his place. He said he could be completely wrong. He said his mother had had a condition that had been mismanaged for 2 years by a specialist who had a professional relationship with her insurance provider, and that he had learned, too late, what that kind of mismanagement looked like from the outside, and that what he was seeing looked similar. Sylvia Vance stood very still. "What exactly?" she said. "Do you think you're looking at?" He said he didn't know. He said he was an electrician. He said the way she held her arm wasn't how people held an arm that was being managed successfully, it was how they held an arm they had given up on. "You're telling me," she said slowly, That I should question the treatment I've been receiving for 3 years. I'm telling you what I observed. What you do with it is your business." She said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked him how long his mother's treatment had been mismanaged before it was caught. He said 27 months. She looked at him once more, really looked, the way she hadn't since he'd walked in, and then she said, "Thank you," in a voice that meant something more complicated than the words, and she showed him out. He heard nothing for 10 days. He told himself he had done what he could, and that was the end of it. He picked Lily up from school. He finished 2 jobs in Sherwood Park. He made pasta on Friday night and helped Lily with a science project about water cycles and tried not to wonder how things had gone. Then, on a Thursday evening, his phone rang from a number he didn't recognize. It was Sylvia Vance. She said she had seen a different neurologist. She said she had brought all of her records. She said the new specialist, a woman named Dr. Osi, who worked out of the University of Alberta hospital, had spent 4 hours reviewing everything and had come to a conclusion that Halvard had not. The medication Sylvia had been on for 34 months was not the wrong medication for her condition. It was the right medication at the wrong dose, titrated specifically to suppress her motor function rather than restore it. It was a modification that required knowledge, intention, and access. The kind of modification that looked, on paper, like a reasonable clinical adjustment, and that would never have been questioned if no one had thought to question it. Sylvia said this in a flat, steady voice, the voice of someone who has already done the emotional part of the thing and is now reporting the facts. Nathan sat on the edge of his couch and said nothing for a moment. "Did you know," he asked finally, "that something was wrong with the treatment?" "I knew something wasn't working," she said. "I didn't let myself know anything more than that. There's a difference." He understood what she meant. "Ms. Vance," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," she said. "You're the reason I finally let myself ask the right question." What came after was slow and public and not his business, except that it was. Prescott Halvard's relationship with Vance Capital, which turned out to be financial through a subsidiary investment structure that had not been disclosed to Sylvia, became the subject of a regulatory complaint filed with the Alberta College of Physicians and Surgeons. The college investigation ran parallel to a securities review. Neither was fast, neither was simple. Halvard's lawyers maintained for months that the dosing decisions had been within clinical norms. They were correct that they had been within norms. What the investigation established, through a review of Halvard's full patient records and a forensic audit of the investment structure, was that the dosing decisions had also been within the range of choices that would keep Sylvia Vance's motor function suppressed long enough for her physical deterioration to be used as the basis for a board confidence motion that would have, had it passed, triggered a succession clause that would have transferred operational control of Vance Capital to a management group in which Halvard held, through the same subsidiary, a significant financial stake. The motion had been scheduled for the April board meeting. It was now March. Sylvia Vance walked into that April board meeting on her own 2 feet, her right hand around a water glass, and she presented the regulatory findings herself. She had notified the board chair the previous week. She had retained independent counsel. She had done everything in the correct order, through the correct channels, and the motion was withdrawn before it was ever raised. Halvard surrendered his license 8 months later, following the college's findings. The securities matter continued for another year. Nathan followed none of it in detail. He learned the outcomes from a news alert that Lily had set up on his phone without asking, because she was 11 and found the story interesting, and because she had a habit of deciding what was important without being told. He ran into Sylvia Vance once more by chance the following November. He was doing a job at a hotel in downtown Edmonton, and she was there for a conference. He was in the service corridor with his tool bag when she came through a door she hadn't expected to open into a corridor and found him standing there with a voltage tester in his hand. They both stopped. She looked, he thought, different. Not dramatically, she was still the same woman, still wore the same quality of clothes, still had the same watchful composure. But she was holding her right hand at her side like a person whose arm was simply resting, not like a person managing something. "Mr. Kowalski," she said. "Mrs. Vance," he said. "How is your daughter?" He told her Lily had made the track team. Provincial qualifier in the 400 meters. Sylvia smiled, a real one, not the kind calibrated for a boardroom. She sounds formidable, she said. She really is, he said. There was a pause, the comfortable kind that only exists between people who have already said the hardest things they need to say to each other. A hand is better, she said, not because he had asked, because she knew he would want to know. Good, he said, just that. She nodded once, pushed open the door to the conference wing, and was gone. Nathan picked up his voltage tester and went back to work. The job took another hour. He drove home in the early dark of a November evening, the city lights coming on in pieces through the windshield, and he thought about his mother, who had never fully recovered her mobility and had spent the last 4 years of her life angry about it in a way she tried to hide and never quite managed to. He thought about the pause, the one he had seen on that Tuesday in February, a woman reaching for a glass and stopping. He thought about the drawing in his shirt pocket, which these days was usually Lily's latest revision of The Horse in the Field, though sometimes it was something else entirely. Today it was a dog she had been lobbying for since September. He thought about how easy it would have been to finish the conduit run and go home and say nothing. He thought about his mother at the dinner table, laughing so no one would watch her face. He drove the rest of the way home thinking about that, and about what it costs a person to perform fine when they are not fine, and about how the distance between those two things, what is real and what is maintained, is sometimes only as wide as the question someone hasn't asked yet. Lily was asleep on the couch when he got in, her track bag on the floor and the television still running. He turned it off. He put a blanket over her. He stood in the dark living room for a moment, listening to the house settle around him in the cold. Then he went to make dinner because it was late, and she would be hungry when she woke up, and that was the next thing that needed doing. I keep coming back to that moment in the parking structure. Nathan sitting in his van for 10 minutes, hand on the key, talking himself out of going back inside. Nobody would have blamed him for driving away. The job was done. The invoice was in. There was pasta to make and a kid who needed new running shoes and exactly zero professional obligation to say anything to anyone about anything he'd seen through a glass wall. That's the part that stays with me. Not the dramatic boardroom moment, not the regulatory findings, not Halvard losing his license, the 10 minutes in the van. Because that's where the real decision happened. Not in front of witnesses, not when it was easy, but in the quiet where no one was watching and it would have cost him nothing to leave. There's something I think we get wrong about people like Nathan. We want to call what he did instinct or luck or a gift, some quality that sets him apart so we don't have to ask too much of ourselves. But what he actually did was pay attention. He noticed a pause. He noticed a tone through a wall. He connected what he was seeing to something he already understood from his own life, and then he did the uncomfortable thing of acting on it. That's not a gift. That's a choice. It's a choice that requires a certain kind of honesty. About what you're seeing, about what it might mean, about whether you're willing to be wrong in front of someone who has every reason to dismiss you. Sylvia's part of this matters just as much, and I don't think it gets enough credit. She had built an entire architecture around not knowing, not because she was weak. She was one of the sharpest people in her field, but because the truth of what was being done to her required her to trust that she deserved better, and that's not always as straightforward as it sounds. When Nathan sat across from her and said the quiet part out loud, she had every reason to walk away. She had walked away from that knowledge for 34 months. What she did instead, letting herself hear it, then following through, took a different kind of strength than running a company. It took the willingness to be right about something devastating. What undid Halvard wasn't genius detective work. It was two people being honest in a small room. One who refused to pretend he hadn't noticed, and one who finally stopped pretending she hadn't noticed either. The consequences followed from that. The second opinion, the forensic audit, the April board meeting, but none of it happens without that first conversation. Without Nathan deciding his discomfort was less important than telling the truth. Without Sylvia deciding her protection of the status quo was less important than asking the next question. I think about Lily's drawing in his shirt pocket, a horse in a field. Good luck on the new job. She didn't know what the job would turn out to be. Neither did he. That's usually how it works. You show up to fix the wiring, and the actual work turns out to be something else entirely. The question is whether you're paying enough attention to recognize it when it's standing right in front of you. and whether, when you do, you have the guts to say something anyway.